Floyd, again. A lot of turmoil going on. This is October the 12th, 2024. There's a big election coming up. A lot of people are afraid of both sides of it. The country's pretty well divided, and the book of Revelation probably has very little to say about what's going to happen. We will try to figure out how to interpret the book of Revelation, but it probably won't affect the election or whatever happens thereafter. We're not in charge of the future. We can't control it. So we study the book of Revelation to find out very basic things about what is God like and what does he expect of us. Now, a person doesn't have to believe the book of Revelation to study it and to read it. It makes fascinating reading. People read fantasy all the time, and if you believe the book of Revelation is fantasy, it's still worth reading. It has its own take on reality. We're not in chapter 4 yet. Once we get there, it will open up some vistas from a higher viewpoint than just some sort of a drone flying around the valley. Right now, I just want to touch on how to interpret Revelation, rules for interpreting Revelation. Now, I could say these are my rules, although I've done really a massive amount of research on how other people interpret the book. And there's a broad spectrum of, it's all fantasy, don't read it, to look at every single word and rip it out of its context and make it say what you want it to say, whatever. Here's what I think is the best way to approach it, with an open mind and with integrity of how to handle language, to figure out what the author, John, meant by what he wrote. Most people think that John wrote it. Whether he was delusional or whatever, irrelevant. What we want to find out is, what did he actually mean by what he said? And here's some basic rules for interpreting any piece of literature. And I will repeat that probably over and over in this video. So, rule number 1. Interpret the Bible by using the Bible's own words when it deals with the same subject in other texts. So if you've never read anything in the Bible, only the book of Revelation, you're at a little bit of a disadvantage in that you don't know what's been said before. That's fine. Somebody's got to start somewhere, and I have a few friends that have started with the book of Revelation before they backed up and read the Gospel of John, which John also wrote. But if you are reading wider or have read wider, try not to take verses out of context and words that are the same in one place as they are in another when the contexts are totally different. Instead of devising our own ideas of meaning, let's try and let the text speak for itself. Rule number 2, read the text and then read the cross-references from the Old Testament. There's a lot of symbolism in this book, so try to find the same symbols in the Old Testament and then figure out what they meant in that context. Try not to read them into Revelation until you've already figured out what they meant in their Old Testament context. To give you a little bit of a hint, you'll find a lot of the same symbols, primarily in the book of Daniel, a lot of them in Zechariah, and then of course a lot of them in Isaiah. Now Isaiah has 66 chapters. There's symbols all over the place. I'm not saying you should have Isaiah memorized, but the more you read it, the more you'll see the symbols that are there. But they have a different context. In some ways, the history is different, the setting, the time, the people are different. Having said that, some of the principles that come out of these symbols would fit very well in the book of Revelation. But you'll have to figure that out as we get deeper. And one thing you need to note is that some prophecies have multiple fulfillments. When the Old Testament prophesied that the Messiah would come to the earth personally as a king, Isaiah 61 prophesied that he would come in love and he would come in judgment. The Jewish people and all the interpreters felt it would be at the same time. The problem is that when Jesus read that prophecy out of Isaiah, he stopped right in the middle of verse 2 and claimed that had been fulfilled today. But the judgment part of the Messiah coming, he didn't quote that. He didn't say anything at all about that. So it seems like the Messiah prophesied coming is prophesied to come twice, and he's already come once, and the second time still coming, which, as we read further, will be at the end of Revelation chapter 19. So some prophecies have multiple fulfillments. If you are of the opinion that a prophecy can only have one fulfillment, okay, good luck with that, trying to figure out some things in the New Testament. The destruction of Jerusalem was prophesied, and in AD 70 it happened. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen again. If God wrote this book, then he has every right and ability to let a prophecy have multiple fulfillments. Just keep that in mind. Now, Rule 2 says read cross-references from the Old Testament. Well, what do you do about the New Testament? You don't want to read too much of the New Testament into Revelation, but there are some passages that directly fit with what's going on in that book. And I first recommend you start with Matthew 24. Having said that, I would back up and read Matthew 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26 to get the context of Matthew 24. It wouldn't hurt to read all the way through Matthew and see how he starts and builds and gets to the point of where in Matthew 24 he starts prophesying some things that also get prophesied in Revelation. Now, I just gave you 3 rules. Rule 1, let the Bible define its own words when dealing with the same subject in different passages. Rule 2, read the Old Testament prophecies, texts, symbols that fit with Revelation. Rule 3, be careful with New Testament, but Matthew 24 has a lot to say in the book of Revelation. Here's Rule 4. Don't read commentaries until you've done rules 1 to 3. You can understand this on your own. You don't need some professional theologian explaining it to you. Luther would say read it on your own. Calvin would say read it on your own. Who are those guys? Well, Google them. Rule number 5. Jesus is the one giving this information to John. In Luke 4, verses 9 to 10, Jesus has just told the parable of the 4 soils, and he didn't explain it. He just walked off. After he left, the Pharisees thought he was an idiot, but his disciples came and asked him what did he mean. Before he told them the meaning of it, and he did tell them the meaning of it, before he did that, however, he said, to you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. The to you was to the people who wanted more information. So Jesus seems to have a principle here, that if a person wants more information, he'll come and ask. He'll keep searching. And Jesus will give him that information. If he doesn't want information, he won't get it. Jesus isn't obligated to tell people everything they need to know if they don't want to know it. That's rule number 5. Don't worry about people who don't want to know whether this book is true or not. If you don't believe it's true, that's fine. Keep watching the videos and keep reading the book. But don't expect God to answer all your questions if you really don't want the answers. You can expect him to answer your questions if you do, but not necessarily at the speed you'd want to get those answers. Rule number 6. We're going to define literal interpretation in a minute, but let me just point out that a non-literal interpretation will leave a lot more questions unanswered than a literal interpretation. And if a person doesn't like the literal meaning and chooses a non-literal meaning, they will probably end up reading their own meaning into the text. Well, good for them. The basic literal view of this book is very simple. There is going to be a 1,000-year reign on this earth in the future. Jesus is going to be reigning as king over that 1,000 years. And during that 1,000 years, the Jews are going to be looked up to because they follow Yahweh, as opposed to anti-Semitism rampant in the world ever since Jesus died on the cross. The world will experience peace and prosperity for that 1,000 years. Very quickly, not a lot of detail, there are basically 3 non-literal interpretations. The first one, very simple, millennial interpretation. There's no millennium. There's no 1,000-year reign. The number 1,000 has no meaning, and the church is now in the millennium, number 1. Number 2, post-millennialism. When Christians bring enough people into the church and get enough people worshiping the true God, by various definitions, then Jesus will look down and say, okay, the earth is good enough for me to come back and set up my kingdom. This view runs rampant when the world is doing really, really well. Oh, it's improving, improving, improving. But when we have a couple of world wars like World War I, World War II, this view kind of tanked because it didn't seem like the world was getting better. With AI and China and Russia right now, it doesn't seem like the world's getting any better. The third non-literal view is idealist. There's nothing in Revelation that should be taken specific. It's all symbolism. We can't really understand it. There's just some general principles of how we should live our life, everyday life, and how we should treat other people. End of subject. Makes a good fantasy book. The problem with this, of course, is there is so much detail specific in the book that it's kind of hard to write it off as general instruction on how to live our lives. Those are the three non-literal views. There are also three time frames in how people interpret this book. Time frame number one, everything in Revelation all took place during the first century after Christ died on the cross, during the Roman era. Time frame number two is the historical view that everything happened in the book of Revelation over the last 2,000 years, which is an interesting interpretation when you try to fit some of the things in Revelation with something someplace in the last 2,000 years. It makes for an interesting fantasy. Number three is that only Revelation 2 and 3 are past tense, and everything else in the book is future. Now, some comments about non-literal interpretation. Every non-literal view has a problem of how languages use everyday things like figures of speech and metaphors and similes, and they claim that those metaphors and similes are not literal viewpoint. The problem with that, of course, is that every metaphor or figure of speech or simile has a literal meaning behind it, and in any given language, any given culture, a person will understand they're trying to find the literal meaning behind the metaphor. One time in Austria, I was speaking to a bunch of students in German, and I said in German that I had put my foot in my mouth. Every student looked down at the floor, then looked up and started laughing. And it dawned on me that I had said it literal words, but it hadn't been a metaphor, it hadn't been a figure of speech. The German way of saying you've said something really stupid is different than just saying put your foot in your mouth. So I had got the figure wrong, and that's why they couldn't figure out what I was literally meaning. I mean, they laughed enough to realize, yes, that's what I meant, but only because they understood English enough to know that I'd gotten it wrong. So a figure of speech, metaphors, all those things, they're part of literal speech. They have a literal meaning behind them, and everybody recognizes it automatically. I'm trying to find the literal meaning behind the figure of speech. Some non-literal views believe that everything in Revelation has already taken place. Good for them. We've kind of touched on that. Other non-literal views believe the book was only written for people, believers in the first century. They simply can't seem to wrap their mind around the possibility that God wrote it for the first century and for every other generation following. Another non-literal view believes that it's only angelic beings are doing the fighting. There's no humans involved, only devils and angels and everything going on, battling it out, however they use metaphorically M16s and mortar rounds. We'll just have to read Revelation, figure out whether or not we think humans are actually involved in it or not. What's fascinating about the non-literal views is that many of them will make as dogmatic statements as you would expect only from a literal view about here's what's going to happen in the future. And I would ask all of my theological friends, non-literal view people, literal view people, do you guys have some sort of secret time machine? You're going to be able to tell us what's actually going to happen? I think we'd probably be better off just reading the book of Revelation and not trying to figure out detail, this is going to happen on this date with these people, etc. But go ahead, be my guest, write books. Okay? And sometimes some of these theologians, when you're reading their books on Revelation, will claim that their view is done after careful exegesis, but actually it's only been done by careful assumptions. Careful exegesis is a term to cover the fact that I want you to believe what I've said or written. It might be careful exegesis from my perspective, but you might have missed something. we need a little bit more humility in our final views. Some non-literal views see no distinction between Israel and the church. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. It does seem in the Old Testament that God made some prophecies that would only fit the Jews, but we have to get through Revelation before we can make a semi-dogmatic statement about that. And there are numerous prophecies in the Old Testament that would be very difficult to apply to whatever definition of church you have, unless you just don't have any definition. It's just a broad category of anybody you want to put in it. For instance, in Genesis 15, when Yahweh, God, promises Abraham and his protege, his children, the land, and he gives the boundaries of that land. The question is then, if the church is Israel, what's the church actually going to get during the millennium, if it's a real millennium? Are they going to get those boundaries? Take your time, look at Genesis 15, figure out what the landmarks are, the boundaries. Look on Google Maps to see if you can find those boundaries, and then ask who gets the land outside of that. A literal translation would say Israel gets that land. And Israel's never had the land within those boundaries since that prophecy was made. It's still out there, standing out there, waiting to be fulfilled, if it's going to be fulfilled literally. Okay, rule number 7. Define literal. The first thing you want to ask is, what is the genre of Revelation? Is it a fiction novel? Is it a newspaper? Is it a doctoral dissertation? Is it a prescription on a bottle of medicine? What genre does this literature fit in? And the word revelation is the genre. The word apocalypse means revelation. So what type of genre was, 2,000 years ago, and somewhat today, apocalyptic genre? Well, during the time of Jesus, there were numerous apocalyptic literature pieces out there, and they all had a few things in common. They all used symbols and visions of all kinds of good things and bad things happening. The gods were always involved, especially the Roman and Greek gods and the other ones. And there was always these spiritual forces battling each other. And they almost always included humanity getting damaged through it all. And most of them pointed toward a better future for humanity after all of the angelic beings had finished killing each other. Some of them had symbols that they considered as codes for secret meetings and secret messages. And those messages, those codes, those meanings were hidden from the general public. Whereas the book of Revelation has a lot about opening up things for the purpose of revealing things to people, to what's going to happen. And the book of Revelation states pretty clearly they want people to know what these symbols mean so they can figure out what's going to happen. Be careful with a time frame, say, oh, that's this and this is that. But the Revelation is really different than most of those other apocalyptic writings. It wants people to know what the symbols stand for. Now, the book of Revelation as a genre also claims to be a book of prophecy. In the Old Testament, 20% of what the prophets wrote told the future. But 80% of what the prophets wrote told them to go back to obeying God, go back to the law and obey what God said. So the Old Testament prophecy, if you will, was kind of an 80% reminder to go back and get your act together. And the prophecies in the Old Testament, as clear as they were not clear enough for the Jews before the time of Jesus to figure them all out. Isaiah 53 was a real conundrum. Nobody could figure that out before Jesus actually died on the cross and rose from the dead. And then Peter, James, and John look at that and go, oh, that's what that meant. Psalm 22, the same thing. It was about a crucifixion. But crucifixions didn't happen for another 800 years. The Romans brought that in, and that was 800 years after David wrote Psalm 22. So some of the prophecies couldn't be understood clearly at the time they were written. They were intended to be understood later with more information, after some aspect of level of fulfillment of those prophecies. They were expected to be understood once they'd been fulfilled. In fact, Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 9, 10, 11, and 12, that even the prophets themselves didn't understand it all, and the angels looking over the prophets' shoulders couldn't understand it all until it actually happened. So our unenviable conclusion is that we're not going to fully understand Revelation until it actually takes place. That's not really scary. If a person knows if you're going to heaven when they die, it in one sense doesn't matter how a person dies, although I don't like pain. I want it to be quick. I want to get hit by a truck coming from behind so I don't see it. I don't want to be tortured. But once a person's dead, they're dead, and it doesn't matter how Revelation turns out. So, how literal can we take Revelation? Well, are the seven churches literal, or are they just symbolic of something? If symbolic, well, we need to understand the symbols in every language. Symbols stand for something literal. Every idiom, every figure of speech has a literal meaning behind it. Remember? The German word for idiom is Redewendung. Rede means talk. Wendung means turn or twist. Turn or twist a literal term into a symbol of that literal term. Figure of speech is just that, a figure. It's not the actual thing. I think I'm going to use the word wooden literalism for when people don't believe in figures of speech as having a literal meaning behind them. And really, symbols are really useless if we can't figure out the literal meaning behind them. Then it just becomes a fantasy book. So the word literal is quite ambiguous. We don't want to get rid of the word. We just need to define it more clearly as to how we're actually going to use it. So we start with this principle, and this is true in every language. Every word has a definition in its own context, and that word might have a different definition in a different context. And this is true in every word in every language. So the first thing we look for when we're, quote, interpreting any passage of any literature, if we find a word we don't understand, we look up the root meaning, and we'd be very careful with that because it's probably not the meaning in that text. But we start with the root meaning. An example. The root meaning of the word black actually means to burn, gleam, or shine. How did black, the color black, come out of that? Genesis 30, verse 3, talks about a black lamb. Is it shiny? Is it burning? Leviticus 11:13 talks about a black vulture. 1 Kings 18:45, the heavens grew black with the clouds. So does the word black mean shining or burning in any of these contexts? No. So the root meaning does not work in these contexts. Well, how did black come from shining and gleaming? Well, here was the logic. Something that burns is shiny. Fire is shiny. And what does something look like after it's been burned? Blackened. Yes. The color black came from the concept of burning something. And that root meaning never is the meaning today in hardly any context. Black is a color, not burning today. It has morphed from root meaning to current context. How about the word nice? That can mean anything you want it to mean. The root meaning of nice is ignorant or foolish. Over time, the word morphed into the meaning ludicrously overdressed. That root meaning doesn't hardly mean that today in any context. We don't normally say someone is nice and mean. Look at how weird they're dressed. Normally. Look up the root meaning of fizzle. I won't do it for you. Remember, the root meaning has to be interpreted in light of the context, and it's probably not the meaning of the verb in that context. So after we've figured out the root meaning and whether it helps us or not, the second point is that literal can mean figures of speech, poetry, overtones, irony, allusions, wordplay. Without these normal usages of language, the interpretation is wooden. We need these things in every language. Number 3, literal also recognizes genre. 4, literal recognizes the audience of the day, who it was written to initially. And number 5, we need to determine the degree of how literal we think something should be interpreted and how specific the details should be understood. Should we understand a horse in Revelation to mean a four-legged animal, horse, or is it a tank, or is it a helicopter? We're going to have fun with that. So here's our procedure, 5 points for reading, studying, interpreting the book of Revelation. Number 1, read the text 7,000 times. That's symbolic. Number 2, figure out the context. Read before, after the passage, under study. Never interpret a verse or a paragraph out of its context. Number 3, define all the words in that specific context. Be careful assuming that all synonyms mean the same thing with each other. No, they don't. Be careful with that. Synonyms are synonyms because they have a variation in meaning, and that might be a key to what the text actually means. Number 4, reread the text to conclude what it means. If you've heard or read a different interpretation of the text, take it seriously and restudy the text through the eyes of those who differ. They may be wrong. They may have a theological agenda, but even if they're wrong, they may point out some things that we missed. Thank the Lord that He's given us a written text that we can understand on our own. But don't stop listening to other people. Now, if we do this procedure, these 4 things, we have just completed an exercise in exegesis. We're taking the text out of itself to see what it says. You let the text speak for itself. You've discovered what the author meant by what the author wrote. You did not perform eisegesis. Eis meaning into. You did not read your meaning into the text. That's a bad idea, since people claim that God wrote the Bible, and if He wrote the Bible, it's kind of a bad idea telling God what He meant when that's not really what He meant. Now, here's a side note, but it's kind of important. People who do not believe the literal interpretation, as I've tried to describe it here, can still clearly understand the literal interpretation of the Bible. Whether they believe it or not, it's easy to understand. Anybody can. Nobody needs the Holy Spirit to understand the literal meaning of the text. God has given every human being the ability to understand language as they grow into a culture and learn the language, even children. So if you are a follower of Jesus and you do believe that the text is inspired, what role does the Holy Spirit play in your reading the text? Well, that's very simple. When you understand what it actually says, as anybody can, then the Holy Spirit prompts you to say, okay, what should you do about it? How should you live based on what you know the text says? The Holy Spirit's job in the life of someone who loves Jesus is to get them to apply the text once they figured out what it says. But let me emphasize and close this off with a statement. Don't apply something you don't know what it means. That will get you in trouble. Okay? Thank you for listening. Hope you come back. The next video we're going to start with Revelation 4, and I make no promises as to what I'm going to say. We'll try and stay as close to the text as we can while we are fabricating all kinds of ideas to see if they even come close to what the text says. Have a good time. Come back. Bye.